Hey everyone, I'm Jordan Dux, Director of National Affairs with Nebraska Farm Bureau, and when I'm not busy trying to track down federal legislation, it's not uncommon to find me in front of a smoker or a grill. In honor of Meat on the Menu Day on March 20th, we're going to focus in on making some pork today. And I'm going to focus in on making two different types of pork loin and also some pork spare ribs. Let's get started. Now today we're going to focus in on pork spare ribs. Now the pork spare rib comes from obviously a pig and a little lower toward the belly, so there's a little bit more fat and a little bit more flavor on these ribs. But what you want to do first is kind of take a look and see if there's any meat on there that maybe just would burn up, just to kind of make the rib rack look a little bit more even. On ribs, on spare ribs, actually on any pair of ribs, you have a membrane here on the back side. Now there are people that take it off, there are people that don't. I'm a person that likes to take them off. And the best way to take them off is just to grab a piece of paper towel, kind of scoot your fingers underneath of there, and if I'm lucky, this will come off in one chunk. And you just take your paper towel and you just pull it off. It's pretty simple. That membrane really doesn't render down, it doesn't really cook out, and so it just sometimes makes the ribs a little chewy. What we're going to do is keep this pretty simple today. We're going to simply apply a slather on there. I'm going to use some yellow mustard. All that's going to do is, it's a binder, it just helps the rub stick to the ribs itself. And it really kind of just allows that rub to adhere nicely on the rib. When we apply their rub, we'll just sprinkle it on. We're not going to rub it in. That's really not something we do. But we're going to try to make this as easy as we can. But like I said, I'm going to cut these ribs in half, just a little easier for my cooker for how that works. But I just slice them in half. You follow that bone, and so you don't cut into that. But I've got 2 racks of ribs here. We're going to start on the back half. And we're just going to take some yellow mustard. This does not taste like mustard when you cook with it, but you just sprinkle a little bit on. Use one hand to slather it on, and it makes it just kind of get it all even on there. And then just take your favorite barbecue rub, something you make yourself, something you buy. I'm one that tends to get a little lazy and buys a commercial rub, so we'll just sprinkle that on. Again, we'll start on the back side of each of these ribs. Try to make it relatively even. Use your hand as a guide if you need to, and you want to go up a little higher, because once you go up a little higher, you actually get a little more even rub on there. And don't forget the sides. Now this rub has some sugar in it, has some salt in it. The one thing you do not want to do before you cook your ribs is apply sauce ahead of time. All that will do is make it burn, and you're going to get ribs that don't taste very good. For pork, something that just has some paprika and some sugar and salt in it, that's a pretty good basic barbecue rub from my standpoint. So now, let's get these things on the cooker. What I'm going to be cooking on is a drum smoker. It's got a basket of charcoal in the bottom. I put some wood chunks in it. The charcoal's already going. We're going to put the way my cooker works is I have hooks in it, and I hang it over the top of the coals for a pellet cooker or anything else like that, or a drum smoker or any other stick burner smoker you have. You're going to want to put them on. We're going to try about 3, there's a lot of ways to do this. We're going to try about 4 hours total, 4 to 5 hours. We'll see. Ribs are kind of done when they're done, so we'll just have to see what they look like. But temperature, anywhere from, we're going to run a little hotter today, probably around 250, 275. You can certainly cook your ribs at a little lower temperature than that if you want to get a little bit more bark to them. But we're going to hook these up. We're going to put them on the smoker, and let's take you outside. All right, as you can see, we've got our smokers going here right now. I actually have some ribs that I had done in a pretty similar way. We started a few hours ago. They're getting a little darker in color, so we're probably going to start wrapping those actually pretty quick. They have about 2 hours of smoke on them, so we'll probably wrap those pretty soon. But we'll put the ribs that we just did. Again, this is 1 rack, and the way mine works is it has these pieces of rebar, and again, the coals are deep underneath of there. And we make it pretty simple. You just take your meat and you do a hook. And these are similar to any ugly drum smoker or anything else that you have. Again, if you have a pellet cooker, you can do the same type of recipe. It just is going to work a little different. I'd keep that pellet smoker at about 250 degrees, maybe a little bit lower. And we'll just simply put the top back on. So we just want to get some smoke, get that surface to absorb a little bit of smoke flavor, and then we'll wrap them up. And we'll show you, we're going to try to make them, we're going to make some sweet ribs, we're going to make some savory ribs, and we'll show you exactly what we're doing here in a second. All right, now that the ribs are on the smoker, they're going, we can set and forget those. Let's focus in on the pork loin. So I have a whole pork loin that I actually cut in half. Again, I cut it in half because I want to make it 2 different ways. And again, you want to take a look and see if there's any excess fat, things that may burn up when you do a cook. And what I'm going to do here with this pork loin, is I'm actually going to do it two different ways. I'm going to grill them both, essentially. I'm not going to smoke one today, but I'm going to try to do it a little bit lower temperature. With a larger piece of meat like this, you don't want to go super hot and fast because you don't want a burnt outside and the inside that's not quite done. But like we did with the ribs, kind of give it a once over and see if there's any excess things you want to trim off. I like to leave the fat on there. The one thing you'll see is that fat is flavor, and so you can certainly trim it off if you'd like, and if you've got it kind of hanging off, you know, be more than happy. Make sure you have a sharp knife and the meat's relatively cold so you don't hurt yourself. But I think largely this one's good to go. Again, similar to the pork ribs, you want to have a little bit of a binder just to kind of help that rub adhere. I'm going to use some olive oil, and so we're just going to put a light coating of olive oil on and just rub that around. That also helps brown the meat a little bit. The main thing I'm going for is it helps that rub that I'm going to apply stick to it. So this one's going to be pretty simple. I could use the barbecue rub that I used on those ribs, but I'm actually going to use something I put together. It's just a pretty simple salt and pepper combination. That's what I tend to use more than anything else. It's just 1 part pepper, 1 part salt, and you use kosher salt. You always want to use kosher salt whenever you're cooking meat. You want those larger granulars of salt in there, and then you use pretty coarse, pretty thick ground pepper. You can use a pepper grinder if you'd like, and we'll use that on our other pork loin. But this also has some garlic powder and onion powder in it. So 1 to 1 on the salt and pepper, and then some onion powder and garlic powder. Just a pretty savory mix of spices, and you just want to pretty liberally apply. This is a pretty big piece of meat, so you want that pretty liberally applied to it when you have it that high up, but you want to get plenty of rub on there, and you just want to press it in. And let's get this one on the grill. All right, so we're just going to use our Farm Bureau gas grill here. This is our big grill that we take around and serve a lot of hamburgers on. But what you want to try to do is set up as much of a 2-zone cooking as you can. A lot of times if you go into cookbooks and you talk to chefs, they're going to tell you want to sear it ahead of time, and then you're going to want to back it off after that. Actually, we're going to do the opposite. It's called a reverse sear. So we're going to go at a lower temperature. It's not nearly as warm right here in this part of the grill. You won't even hear it sizzle. And we'll shut the end off, but we want this to cook at a relatively low temperature first. We're going to cook anymore. USDA recommends that pork can be cooked to a medium rare temperature of 145 degrees. So we're going to only let it cook about that far. But on the initial, before we actually put it on the hot part of the grill, we're going to cook it to probably about 120 degrees or so. And what that does is that not only keeps the meat tender, but it also allows, and we do this on beef as well, and we'll get into that on the beef side of things, but this allows for a more even distribution, a more even color throughout. So you're not having the outsides that are a lot more well done and the inside that is rare or medium rare. But this actually doing a 2-zone, you do the reverse sear where you can cook it and seal it up to where you do a lower temperature first and then put it on a hot grill and create that crust and that nice bark on the outside. That's what we're going to do with the pork. That's what I try to do with beef, and we'll get into that. And now let's go back and work on that other pork loin. All right, so now we have that more lean piece of the pork loin that we're going to do something a little different with. And I'm using the same cutting board, that salt, pepper, garlic, onion powder. That's certainly fine on the outside of this so it can get a little bit of that rub that got off of there. But what I'm going to try to do, and I'm going to say try to do, is I'm going to try to jelly roll this out. So what I'm going to try to do is take a cut, and I'm almost going to fillet this thing out to where it's a longer, flatter piece of meat. And what I'm going to do then is stuff it with prosciutto, garlic, Parmesan cheese, and then some Italian seasonings, and then we're going to tie it up, and then we'll grill that. So we'll start in. You want to keep it relatively thin. You want to kind of cut down by going, you want to keep a little bit there so you're not cutting all the way through, but you need to start off cutting a little bit through, and then you come in at a little bit of an angle, and you can kind of work your way and see approximately how thick. You want it about a 1/2 inch thick across, and you want a really sharp knife when you're doing this so it almost looks effortless. You want the knife to do the work here. This is the part that's always the trickiest. You don't want to go too far back before you start making that additional cut here. There we go. Not perfect, but I think that's about as good as we're going to get. So you want to lay it out relatively flat. And now we're going to start in with our salt and pepper to initially get some seasoning on there. So I'm using some kosher salt. As I said, you always want to not be scared of putting plenty of salt. These are larger pieces of meat. That Parmesan cheese has some certainly has some saltiness, but you want to apply your salt on the inside relatively liberally so you have some nice flavoring. Put some fresh cracked pepper on there. Salt and pepper, kind of the basis for everything. And then I'm going to add in just some basic Italian seasoning. So this is your mixture of your parsleys and your oreganos, and just layering this on the bottom. So again, this is going to be an Italian stuffed pork loin. So now that we have that, I'm going to take my prosciutto. Now, prosciutto is just Italian ham, so it's cut really thinly. You'll see it has a lot of fat striations in it, but that's just a nice salty interior for this pork loin, this Italian pork loin. And so I've got a good layer of that on. All right, so now I'm going to take my garlic, and I'm not going to add a ton, even though I love garlic. But you want to add in, just kind of evenly layer, kind of sprinkle it around on the inside. All right. And now, the last thing, we're going to use some Parmesan cheese. So now you just want to sprinkle in. We don't want a ton of cheese, it's just to add a little bit. We don't want it to truly leak out the sides a ton, but you want a little bit of cheese in there. All right, I think that's good. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take some twine, use butcher twine. Frankly, I tend to use just some cloth fabric twine that my wife has. For sewing and things like that, but I end up just taking these, and you want to put them kind of evenly spaced throughout the meat, because we're going to roll this up and then we're going to need to tie it, but we're going to tie each of these pieces of twine underneath, about 4 or 5 pieces, and that'll keep it all together, and then we'll go put it on the cooker. So now what we're going to do is season the outside of this one. So you can go really basic. I'm probably going to put just a little bit of salt and pepper on the outside, just as we did. We added plenty of salt, so go maybe a touch lighter than what I did, since we already have it on the outside. But a little bit of salt and a little bit of pepper, and kind of roll it around. Don't roll it too much to where you start losing a lot, and I still have some seasoning from the board on there. But then we'll cut these extra pieces of string off. It's always good just to... and this is certainly something you don't have to put on a grill when you have an Italian flavored like this. You can decide if you want to put it in an oven. I've got a grill in front of me today and not an oven, so I'm going to grill it, and hopefully it turns out just the same. All right, I think we've got our Italian stuffed pork loin ready to go. And just like our other pork loin, we want to try to put it on the spot on the grill that's a little bit cooler, and we'll go take that out, and we'll put it on the cooker. And we'll go check some pork ribs too. I think we're going to check our pork ribs, our spare ribs again. I think we're getting to definitely the temperature where we want. They've got a nice dark color to them. They look a little darker on the top than what they do a little further down. But again, what I'm going to do is pull a rack out just to kind of see what they look like. Again, you'll be able to see I've cut all mine in half, so they're a little bit shorter. You can see they've got some really nice color to them. They're starting to get a little bit more tender right now. If you temp it out, it's 186 at the bottom, probably on the 170, 160, 70 at the top. So these are probably ready to be wrapped up, and we're going to wrap them up, and we're going to put them back on. We're not going to keep them on the hooks on this cooker. We'll wrap them up a little differently, but we'll take a look. We'll get these wrapped up, and we'll make them a little bit sweeter and a little bit more yummy, and we'll go from there. So now that we've had the ribs on for a couple hours of smoke, now we're going to wrap them up, and this is going to make them tender. And so what we like to do, and normally I'm missing one ingredient, but what we like to do normally is take your piece of rib, put it in a piece of aluminum foil, and you're going to wrap it up. And while there's plenty of fat in there, it's always good just to add a little bit more and to make it a little bit more savory. So I've got just some basic squeeze butter here, and so you want to squeeze some butter on both sides, kind of put it on the foil so you have it on both sides, and then we'll normally douse it in some honey and some brown sugar if you want some ribs that are a little bit sweeter. And I don't have my brown sugar with me today, so I just have some honey, but that should make them pretty sweet. So we'll wrap them up, so just some butter, some honey, and then again some brown sugar normally. And what you'll do is you'll wrap them up. You want to wrap them pretty tight. You want them to get tender, and that's what the foil helps with, but you don't want them to truly steam in there. So you want to wrap them up pretty much as tight as you can, like this in a little packet, and then we'll throw these on the smoker. So on my more savory ones that I did not add kind of the sweeter rub to, I'll pull out one of those and just kind of walk you through. Same type of thing. All I'm going to do is do the squeeze butter on those. Again, all it does is add a little bit more liquid to it, keeps things moist. I'm going to add just a little bit of squeeze butter on the bottom, a little bit of squeeze butter on the top, and then again, you want to wrap them pretty tight. Notice that we still have not added sauce to anything on these ribs. We'll do that at the absolute very end, and we'll put these ribs back on the smoker, and we'll only let them go maybe for another 30, 45 minutes or so. These got a little bit more done than I normally will go. So there's no need for them to stay too terribly long, and we'll get these on the cooker and we'll go from there. All right, back to the cooker now. I put my grate back on, and again, it's just the way I've got it. You just put it back on your cooker. Again, you want to keep your temperature. You always want to maintain that temperature at about 220, 250 degrees, something like that. You can cook them just a little bit warmer, a little bit lower. And I'm just going to stack these up in here. So again, this is a matter of just keeping them and starting to make them tender. So there we go. And I'll put the lid back on and I'll check on these in probably about 30 minutes and just see close as to where they're at. And then we'll check and see what the tenderness is, and we'll kind of unwrap one and kind of see where we're at, and we'll go from there. Let's go back over here to our pork loin and kind of see where we're at. I think that our basic one is probably getting close to temperature. It's looking pretty good. We're at about 126, 130 on this back side, 138, 140. So that back side is pretty well done. So we actually are going to flip this one around. So it's obviously a little hotter back there. We want to try to protect that as much as we can. 138, you know what, we may pull this. That inside is just a little bit cool yet, still 126. We'll maybe let that sit for just a little bit. So this one, our prosciutto one, still at only 89, 90 degrees, 100 degrees on that back side. We'll maybe flip that one around a little bit. Just be cognizant there. But notice that, you know, we're cooking at a relatively low temperature. That inside is getting pretty done. What does this backside look? Oh yeah, we've got really nice brown color. Another thing that a lot of people like to talk about are grill marks and things like that. And really what you should be gunning for is more so what this is, where you've got a lot more brown throughout. That brown is flavor, and you don't like to have that flavor just on where the individual bars are on your grill. So having something that has universal color kind of spread throughout is a pretty good goal to have. It's going to taste a little bit better. Yeah, we're sitting kind of where I want to be, about 138, 140. This one's almost done. We'll probably pull that off here pretty soon. Again, our Italian one sitting at about, depending upon where you're at, on the piece of meat itself, in the 90s, 100s. So we'll come out and check that one here in a little bit too. I think our ribs are done, so I'm going to pull them off the cooker. They've been on for a little over an hour. And so they're pretty nice and tender. The way I like my ribs, and the way I think they try to do, is you want them to be tender. They want to come off the bone cleanly, but you still want to be able to take an individual bite and not have the whole thing fall off of there. Some people like them more tender. If so, keep them on a little bit longer. But what we'll do is we'll sauce a couple of them up, and then we'll put them back on the smoker just to get the sauce nice and tacky, and we'll go from there. We're going to take some of these out, like I said, and we're going to try to sauce a couple of them. These are the ones that have the sweeter rub on them. But all you need is, you don't want to take, this barbecue sauce here is room temperature. You don't want it to be cold, because that'll cool down the surface part of your ribs. But what you want to do is just room temperature or warm barbecue sauce. Just put a thin layer over the top. You can do a little bit on the bottom, and just create basically a little bit of sheen, more so than anything else. And then we'll put those back on the smoker for about 10 to 15 minutes just to get it kind of tacked on there nice. And we'll go from there. Okay, so again, it's not so much time as you want temperature. So on pork loins, you don't want to overcook them, about 140 degrees internal. You can see again, we got some nice color on the outside. This was just the basic one with salt and pepper and garlic powder and onion powder. This one was the Italian one that we wrapped up. We have prosciutto and Parmesan cheese in there and some garlic. We temped out all right. And so we'll now cut it up and see what we've got. And again, you want to cook pork loin, and actually all pork, unless you're going to pull it, you only want to cook it to a medium rare temperature. So as you can see, you want to make some nice slices. We still have some nice color there. There's still an awful lot of moisture that's literally just dripping off of it. That's what you want. Pork loin, way too often people overcook it. Their memory of pork is always way too dry. But this one, again, this was the side that was probably a little bit, actually if you want to think of it as a steak, this is the part that is like the spinalis muscle on a ribeye steak, that really tender part on the outside. This is a similar way with this pork loin. So this part's a little bit more dense. This is the part that's a little bit more tender. So that's this basic one, and I think it looks pretty good, turned out pretty good. We have a nice crust on the outside of this one, and now this one you want to slice kind of the same way. And again, remember we kind of jelly rolled it together. And this one was the side that was a little bit more lean, so you won't have quite as much, probably not quite as much moisture, some tenderness, but certainly you can see that garlic, the Italian seasoning, and then the Parmesan cheese melted just a little bit on the inside, but that's all nice and cooked on the inside. I think we did a decent job on the pork loin here. We'll be back on the pork side to look at our spare ribs here in a little bit. All right, so I took the ribs off the smoker. Again, all I did is apply a light amount of sauce to them. You just make them shiny. You just want it to tack up nice. You don't want it to drip off and have them too saucy. Again, this is how I do them. You can do them however you want. You see, they still hold together. They don't completely rip apart. But that's how I make a spare rib. And then you just take them and you cut them individually. You flip it over and find where the bones are at, and you have them. And that's a pretty decent looking spare rib for me.